Jan and I are excited to be here and excited you are all here as well. We're going to make you sit for a while, but you're not going to be able to sit for much longer because we're going to try at the end of this evening to get you doing things. That's the point. This is not an academic evening. This is an evening about doing things and taking action. So as we set out to understand U.S. competitiveness, the first question we really had to address for ourselves was, what do we mean by competitiveness? How do we tell whether a country is competitive? And here, there's actually a lot of confusion that's really hurt the public debate. It's actually affected a lot of us in business and the way we've reacted to this issue. So, as you see here, we believe that competitiveness is defined as the simultaneous ability to achieve two things. The U.S. is competitive if U.S.-based companies can compete successfully in international markets. That's kind of intuitive. We understand that. But there's another part. The U.S. is competitive if we can do that while simultaneously maintaining and improving the standard of living for the average American. Having companies succeed while wages fall and jobs get cut and our currency devalues, that's not a sign of competitiveness. That's a sign that we're not competitive. Conversely, if workers do well but American companies can no longer compete, that's not victory either. How do we solve this equation of competitive companies and prosperous citizens? The only way we can solve that equation is by being highly productive. We have to be a highly productive location in which to do business to justify and support the high wages that we want to earn and sustain and improve over time. And it's this ability to be productive that has to be the central focus of all of our economic policy. Just creating jobs is the wrong way to look at it. We have to be competitive. And if we can think this way and behave this way, we're not in a zero-sum game with other countries in the world. Many countries can improve their productivity. Many countries can improve their prosperity. This expands the pool of demand in the world that hopefully America will be equipped to get its fair share of in terms of serving those markets. Now, that leads to the second question. Based on this definition, do we have a problem in the U.S.? And this is a question that our faculty team really had to confront again very, very early. I guess we all had a deep disquiet about this issue, but ultimately we had to have more than just a disquiet. We had to really understand what was going on. We came to the conclusion that this is more than just a sharp economic downturn. This is more than just indigestion from a consumption bubble in areas like housing and elsewhere that we're also familiar with. It is these things. We're experiencing these things. They're real, but it's more than that. And we have considerable evidence from the last decade or two that something has gone wrong in what was an enormously dynamic and vital American economy over time. The first really wake-up call here is actually the American job machine. For decades and decades and decades, America generated about 2% new jobs every year, with ups and downs. You can see that slide here. In 2001, however, something profound started to happen. That job machine started slowing down, and you can see how abruptly it's fallen. It's bounced back a little, but it's still at an anemic rate. All the jobs we created, the net jobs we created, over the last decade or so, have been in parts of our economy that are not exposed to international competition. This is a staggering finding. Those jobs have been in construction, in real estate, in retailing, in healthcare, in government, but not in those businesses where we actually have to compete. Something has gone wrong with the fundamentals of the American economy. It started well before this 2007-2008 recession. We're all aware of the similar disquieting data on wages. For the middle and below middle class workers in America in particular, wages have been stagnated for well over a decade. Really only the very top of the income distribution has seen reasonable gains in income. We're not supporting rising standard of living. for our citizens. That has not been true for some time now, a disturbing sign. And finally, and there's more we could cover, the participation of Americans in the productive economy has started to significantly decline. Again, this started happening way back well before the economic downturn. Back in the 1997, I think, is the peak of this chart. The actual participation of Americans of working age in the economy started to fall down. These data and others like them convinced us on the faculty that there was something fundamental going on here, and we decided to take on this issue. And now I'd like to turn it over to Jan to tell you a little bit about what we did and some of the things that we've found.
Great, thank you, Mike. So Mike has described some of the troubling trends that we see from the past. To get at the current and future state of U.S. competitiveness, we sought out the perspectives and the experiences of the Harvard Business School alumni base, who are very much on the front lines of global business. I suspect that many of you are among the nearly 10,000 HBS alumni who were kind enough to make their way through the extensive survey that we administered last October. We are deeply grateful, and we can thank you tonight by sharing some of the findings. So our respondents told us three things. First, that the U.S. faces a deepening challenge to its competitiveness. To get at this, we went right back to the definition that Mike identified before, and we asked two key questions. In 3 years' time, do you think that firms in the U.S. will be more or less able to succeed in the global economy? And in 3 years' time, will U.S. firms be more or less able to pay workers well? And the vast majority of our respondents, 71%, said that on one or both of these dimensions of competitiveness, the U.S. will be worse off in 3 years. In fact, when we focus just on respondents from the New York area, the pessimism deepens a little bit. The figure rises to 73%. Respondents were worried about both U.S. firms and U.S. workers, but on balance were more concerned about workers than firms. And that makes some sense, because when faced with global competition, firms have fairly good alternatives. They can trim headcount, they can cut costs, they can innovate, they can move abroad. Workers often have fewer and far worse alternatives. Second, our respondents shared with us their personal experiences in firm location choices, which are an important indicator of U.S. competitiveness. It turns out that more than 1,700 of our respondents had personally been involved in a U.S.-related location choice in the past year. Some of those were about offshoring, taking activities currently in America and potentially moving them to other countries. Some were about onshoring, taking activities currently in other countries, potentially moving them to America. And others were about setting up new activities that might go into the U.S. The respondents noted a few troubling facts for us. First, the dominant flow of activity is out of the U.S. We sometimes read these days hopeful stories about activities that are returning to America. We did see that in our survey, but by far the more dominant flow was outward. In fact, a HBS alum based in the U.S. is 3 times more likely to be considering moving activity out of the U.S. than an HBS alum based outside the U.S. is likely to be thinking about moving something into the U.S. Second, when those decisions are made, the U.S. win-loss ratio is not encouraging. About 1,000 of those decisions were about potentially offshoring activities. Once those decisions were resolved, 5 times out of 6, the activity did move out of the U.S. Overall, the U.S. won only 1 out of 3 of the decisions for which it was a finalist. You might hope that the things that are moving out are low value added or small activities, and that the things moving into the U.S. or being set up here fresh are larger facilities with high-end R&D, advanced manufacturing, and so forth. In fact, the evidence we find is very much to the contrary. The high-end stuff is moving out. Finally, the survey allowed us to look at the underlying business environment of America. And here, our respondents were actually fairly optimistic and felt good about the current U.S. environment compared to other advanced economies. It was when we asked them to compare the U.S. to emerging economies and to the future, looking to the future, that the pessimism tended to come out. In particular, we could ask respondents about 17 elements of the business environment, which prior research has shown to be drivers of competitiveness, and find out 2 things. First, how is the U.S. doing today compared to other economies? That'll be the horizontal axis on this graph. And second, how is the U.S. doing in terms of its trajectory? Is it pulling ahead or falling behind other economies? We got some good news, right? Some good news. There are some real strengths, core strengths of the American economy that are perceived as getting even stronger, right? Our system for entrepreneurship and innovation, the quality of management in the U.S., our capital markets, which are vibrant, property rights, the university system. So the glass, according to our respondents, is definitely some fraction full. The bad news is that these strengths increasingly are neutralized by other factors. We found a set of things that were viewed as current U.S. strengths, but deteriorating. The infrastructure of the country, the ports, the roads, the bridges, as well as the availability of skilled labor. And in fact, when activities were considered for offshoring, the availability of skilled labor was more often cited as a reason to move out of the U.S. than to stay here, right? Finally, and perhaps most distressingly, there were a number of weaknesses that are considered to be getting worse. The convoluted tax code, the gridlock in the political system, the macroeconomic policies of the country, the K-12 education system, the legal and regulatory frameworks. And these are where I think our greatest concerns lay. You may wonder how the responses of folks in the New York area differ. For folks from New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, what we find is they are more concerned than the rest of the population about the tax code, K-12 education, and infrastructure, and are more optimistic than others about the capital markets, in which, of course, many in New York participate. Right? Now, as a faculty, we've tried to tackle many of these elements, and the March issue of the Harvard Business Review is committed entirely to U.S. competitiveness. You'll see individual articles outlined here, many of which dive deeply into individual elements. We've tried to cover the spectrum, all the way from David Moss, who's in the bottom left quadrant looking at the political system, to Bill Salmon and Josh Lerner in the upper right quadrant looking at the future of entrepreneurship. And we try to get a full range of the factors that underlie the state of U.S. competitiveness. Now, if that matrix describes where we are, there are two natural questions. One is, how did we get here? And the second is, where might we go next? And I'm going to tackle the first easier question and leave the question of where we might go next to Mike. How did we get here? There are many, many factors in play here, but I think a basic narrative is worth keeping in mind. The narrative starts in the 1980s when changes in geopolitics and technology suddenly opened the world to business. That the geographic options open to managers expand dramatically. At the same time, certain changes in governance in America increased the focus of many managers and some politicians on the near term. Time horizons shortened. And the combination of broadened geographic time horizons and shortened time horizons makes it nearly inevitable that business people in the U.S. and elsewhere will increasingly explore the globe, sometimes looking for the best deal they can get today from each individual area. And the ensuing globalization has had enormous positive effects on the world economy. But there are also some troubling challenges that brings with it. One of those challenges is that the connections between companies and the communities in which they operate, which were naturally there when companies were confined geographically, those connections start to fade, and with them, the public goods in which firms had steadily invested. A second problem that this brings on is that it brings enormous pressure on the middle class of our society, who suddenly find themselves in competition with hundreds of millions of skilled and hungry individuals from around the world. And the trends that Mike mentioned earlier, the stagnation of wages, the cessation of growth in the traded sectors of the economy follow. Meanwhile, if you are the upper end of the skills distribution and you've got skills that are globally applicable, this becomes a global, a golden age in many ways, and I suspect many in this room, many of us were in that position. We see income inequality skyrocket as a result. Now, as a society, how do we respond to increasing pressures on the middle class? One response is to double down, to make sure that every citizen of the country has the ability to be highly productive in a new and more challenging global economy. Unfortunately, I think we've seen less of that than another response. Another natural response would be to make unsustainable promises, right? Promises like we're going to extend you credit, and we want you to consume, particularly housing stock. Promises like the government will cover an increasing portion of your health care costs during your retirement. Promises like the government will increasingly be the direct employer of many people. You take those promises and you couple them with 2 costly wars and a nasty recession, and you wind up with a government that's very hobbled, that lacks both certainly the resources and arguably the political will to invest in the things required to make our society highly productive and competitive. So we wind up with a fairly toxic combination of footloose companies and a hobbled government, neither of which has the ability and the will and the resources to invest in individuals and innovation, infrastructure, and institutions to make the U.S. a competitive place. Now, with that sobering narrative, we turn it back to Mike to talk about where the U.S. might go from here.
Well, Jan, I certainly got the hard one here. Thank you. When we think about what needs to be done, I think the obvious part, is clear to all of us. There's a lot of things that government needs to do better in America, especially at the federal level. You saw, that at the lower left hand of our survey chart, and I think this is something that we've been discussing in America now for some time. Somehow our government policies are not addressing, if you will, the fundamental issues. Instead, they're making unsustainable promises, as Jan recounted. But as much as government is critical and as much as we care about seeing if we can influence government, our real focus in this project is really to think also about what's the role of business. What's the role of us? What can we do without the need for government, without passing legislation, without having to troop down to Washington? And here, I think we've come to understand and think a lot about the company role on the competitiveness of a country like the U.S. And of course, the U.S. is not homogeneous. It's a bunch of regions. And so companies also have a profound influence on the region in which they are operating or have their major facilities. And the question is, what should companies do? What's their role in competitiveness? And as Jan said, a lot of this thinking has been shifting lately because, of course, as companies got more global, we hear over and over again, well, we're not a U.S. company anymore. We're a global company. And at least at the first level, that says, well, gee, we don't have to worry about the U.S. and our communities anymore. That's not our job. Well, what we've come to understand is, yes, it is your job. The most fundamental impact a company makes on competitiveness is by doing its business well, by innovating, by being productive, by growing its business. And by and large, American companies have done okay there in many respects. But companies also have an ability to affect U.S. competitiveness, and by that I mean the quality of the business environment surrounding them. We call this the commons. All of us in business, we depend on the commons. We depend on an environment from which we draw people and skill and various other kinds of assets. In business, we tend to think what happens within the walls of the company. But I think less understood has been the impact of what's going on outside the boundaries of the company, which actually fundamentally affects our ability to be productive and have the right people and innovate. Contributing to the commons, in this sense, is not about patriotism. Contributing to the commons is not about charity or being philanthropic. Contributing to the commons is about growing a company sustainably in the long run. Letting the American communities in which we do business lose out because the failure to think this way is not ultimately going to allow us to be successful going forward. The globalization era that we've been through has confused a lot of us in business about how to think about this issue. And in the rush to globalization, we believe, very strongly believe, we in business have neglected some of our most fundamental role to our own detriment as businesses. Now, what Jan has said is that, there's really two ways that companies can engage with their location. One way is to kind of invest in making that location better and then reaping the benefits that come from that. The other is to take advantage of getting the best deal. Why do we have a convoluted tax code in America? Well, one reason is that a lot of us in business have been trooping to Washington and negotiating all these special tax breaks that have loaded up our tax system with complexity. So we in business are partly the reason why some of the things that have eroded our competitiveness from a public policy point of view have actually happened. What we would have asked you in the survey is, what would you do as a business, not to lobby government, but as a business to address U.S. competitiveness? And these are some of the responses we got. Most of you, I think, have understood that we have to address in the fundamental assets and skills and innovation environment in order to sustain the future of our business. But some of us are still focusing on our own narrow self-interest. And you can see the distinction here on the two sides of this chart. A little later on this evening, Bill George is going to talk a little bit about what specifically we believe each of your companies can do to address U.S. competitiveness without waiting for anybody else. Some of the commitments that we would like to get more of our business leaders to make are just illustrated here on this slide. You'll see more of this later. Let me show you another set of commitments. These are things that we can do in business that will benefit our companies, but will also strengthen the commons that has been eroding over the last several decades. So what are we going to do next here? We believe that this is not a call to despair. We believe that the issues that are facing the U.S. economy are real, but we have some profound strengths that we've managed to hold on to if we can just reinvest behind them. Our problems are the result of things we've chosen to do or most often not do in America. There's not some unstoppable forces or technological trends that doom us to any future. We can actually shape our own future. At this particular moment in the history of America, we believe that we in business have to step up and get much more actively involved in this agenda. And that we can, and that we have leverage, and that we can actually change the trajectory here that we're on. So for the rest of the evening, what we're going to do is this. In the next session, we're going to dig more deeply into some of the research we've done, the diagnosis, and some of the things that need to be done from a policy point of view and to some extent from a business point of view. Then after that, in the next panel, the last panel, we're going to hear from some distinguished practitioners about what's already going on in the business community and with business working with government together that's really moving the needle on competitiveness in regions around the country. Hopefully, at the end of this session, we will get all of you to actually join us, join HBS, in seeing if we can lead a kind of a new chapter in how we in business really approach the whole question of the future of America. And if we can get you on board that effort, we can get anything done.